This is, in fact, a very, very topical moment. It's fashionable again to think about protecting the national security of the United States. It has not always been that. It's gone ebbed and flowed over time. But as we think about all the geopolitical and other factors out there, we're going to see a continuing set of crises. Peace has not broken out yet and is not likely to break out soon. You've seen a lot of increased interest in in funding defense, recognizing that technological supremacy, if it's well applied, can make a huge difference. And in fact, the goal I used to say when I was running Northrop is our job is to make sure our young men and women in uniform never come in second in any war. Never, ever, ever. There is a tremendous growth now of new technologies that are being applied to defense. Things such as autonomous pilots, military training simulation using advanced techniques, air defense sensors. The opportunities for startups in this area has seen a new renaissance. There were a series of startups back in the 40s and the 50s, even in the 60s. We went into a period where the larger companies kind of dominated, such as my own company. And now we're at a period where innovation is not only possible, but it's actually welcome and extraordinarily important. So we are very fortunate today to have this group of panelists with a very interesting, diverse set of perspectives on the problem. So let me start off with General Allen, and maybe, John, if you could set the stage, take us up to 100,000 feet. What do you see? Where are things going? And then maybe we can then work to why it's important to think about the need for innovation in defense in the United States.
Sure. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I enjoy this conference every time I've been here. Matt Spence, I don't know where Matt went, but he sat right next to me in the Middle East negotiating with the Israelis and the Palestinians years ago. And we made great progress under Matt's leadership. The challenges we face today as a country are really difficult to express in such a short period of time. But I think one of the greatest challenges we face for the military is to be able to embrace the kinds of technologies that can really accelerate our warfighting capabilities. You've heard perhaps of the theory of warfighting called hyperwar, which is war that is accelerated to such a great extent by virtue of the presence of artificial intelligence, compute power, and other big data analytical capabilities. It's accelerated to such an extent that the role of the human now becomes a matter of a different perspective. And I think that's what we're going to be facing as time goes on. The more that we are able to bring these technologies into our intelligence collection, dissemination, analysis and dissemination, our command and control in terms of decision support, decision assistance, and ultimately bring that kind of capability into our targeting for precision targeting, et cetera. This is going to give us the capacity to outpace, overmatch in time our opponents. The challenge has been whether we're able to really bring those kinds of technologies into the Department of Defense. It's been very difficult over the years for startups to get access into the Department of Defense. Often they are forced into the channels. But there have been some very interesting innovations, organizational innovations in the department in the last several years to try to streamline this. The Defense Innovation Unit is a big player in this regard. So we have a representative of DIU. Actually, he had the courage to raise his hand. If you've got a good idea and you want to do work with the Department of Defense, see him immediately after this is over. But the challenge, I think, Ron, is our capacity to bring technology into our warfighting capabilities to the extent that we can, not to the extent that we want to, because the challenges are really significant at this point. The geopolitical issue, though, is really fraying for us right now. The rules-based system, and I don't mean to go on so long, the rules-based system that was brought about by the United States in the aftermath of World War II and the Cold War, it truly is fraying to a point where we could potentially see it collapse, I think. And the transatlantic relationship, which has really been the basis in so many respects for the peace and the prosperity we've seen around the world, not just in Europe, that's taken a terrible blow in the last 43 days. And there are more blows to be delivered, I'm afraid. And so while I think NATO will continue and the transatlantic relationship will continue, we've seen a tremendous blow to trust. And the question is whether our allies can trust the United States now in the environment that we're in. And I'll stop there.
Okay, a lot to chew on. So let's do this. Let's ask each of our two entrepreneurs to give us maybe a quick summary of who are you and what is it your company does. Let me start with Ethan, if you could, and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So started Mach. I think we're all on the same page about how much unmanned systems will change warfare, but looking to have a hardware first approach to really defining what war looks like in 2 decades. So what does it look like to have survivable manufacturing capacity? What will those offensive platforms look like? What will those defensive platforms look like? And then going and taking venture dollars to bring those platforms to the warfighter.
Yep. Great.
And tell us a little bit about yourself. You dropped out of college to do something, right?
I did.
It must have been
Yes.
pretty important. What was it?
I think in light of 2 things, it's very important to be doing this work right now. It's global power competition,
Yep.
right? Specifically on unmanned systems, China matches our tech and totally dominates on scale. So if we're not pulling things left correctly, if we're not fighting asymmetrically, we won't be in a position to win a war against them. And then 2 is just how much unmanned systems will change the way wars are fought. I think it's very sort of linear to look at what it looks like to put an RPG round on a quadcopter. But once you start sort of considering the extrapolation of that technology over the next 10, 20 years, what does it look like to manufacture in a world where we actually don't get defense from the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean because fires are so proliferated and so long range that you can reach out and touch anywhere on Earth. So for us as a company, it's really looking to forge that offset to China and then make sure the U.S. is appropriately adopting unmanned systems.
Ron, if I could come in, it's hard to overstate how important it is what he's doing and what he just said. Because in Ukraine today, 70% of the battlefield casualties occurred from unmanned systems. So there's fighters, there's helicopters, there's tanks, there's artillery, but you can't take your eyes off the skies because those unmanned systems will kill you in a second. They're extremely lethal, and again, 70% of the casualties are coming from drones.
Wow, yeah, that is a change. It's a laboratory in process.
That's right.
With blood and blood being spent to do it.
We have not adopted that kind of opportunity yet.
No, not yet. Well, hopefully we're learning. So Pervinder, you've stepped in to take over an interesting company and you're taking it to the next level. Tell us a little about yourself and the company.
So, as you know, I took over from the founder of Spark Cognition about a year back, and we refocused the company, renamed it, and it's now called Avathon. Moved the headquarters from Austin to Silicon Valley, which is where I've been for quite some time. And our focus is on building industrial AI platform which are dual purpose. So both commercial use and for DoD or for government in general. I think we're talking about DoD today, but the same thing applies to DOE and same thing applies to Department of the Interior on mining and others. But I will stay focused more on what we do on the DoD side. So we look at the word edge, everything is around capital assets. And if you think of it, it's around fleet readiness. And then you divide it up into almost 3 chunks of fleet. The fleet which has been out there today. Right? So if we think of our F-16s and F-18s and all of the naval ships and others, these are all the assets which are out there. And we are applying artificial intelligence to both renew these assets because they're not going away anytime soon. So how do you go renew it? And how do you increase the fleet readiness, which number is still embarrassingly low? And if it was a real business versus DoD, I think those numbers you cannot operate an asset business. So that's the readiness part of it. Second part is that we are building these new assets. And I was with someone who is associated with the new government this morning. And it was a discussion on that we are going and buying these assets, and it's going to take you 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before you get delivery. But they're still built on older technology, not really applying the AI. So we are continuing to invest on it. So we're back to that. How do you go embed technology into the assets being built now? So you get into supply chain and manufacturing, and how do you go do even something as simple as inspection using visual and AR, VR things which are not there. And then you have the third one, which is what I think, John, you talked about, the hyperwar and unmanned kind of regime, kind of both on commercial side. See, commercial side, if you think of it, Ukraine is a good example of unmanned.
That's right.
But on commercial side, FAA is years away from allowing for autonomous kind of flying because we have a different security risk and how do you go do it. We have a joint venture with Boeing called SkyGrid, which is working on autonomous air traffic control system. Because by the time you have air taxis and others, you won't really be able to get to enough air traffic controllers around the world. So on our focus is on all three aspects. Right? So one is that how do you go optimize the current fleet? And just to give you some numbers, I think we spend what $300 billion, John, of the DoD budget around maintenance and
That's right.
operations. $100 billion is just on direct material procurement on that, and then the people related to it. Spending $140 billion on logistics, including contested logistics today. Right? So applying kind of AI technology, which is what we are focused on, we think you can take 50 billion or more a year out using technology, not by cutting people, but by using technology on that side. And then there is that, where is the budget going to come for the number 2 and number 3 I talked about. And unless you optimize it, the current spend, there won't be enough money left to go into the innovation. So this continuum is very, very critical from just our national defense perspective. And it's the similar issue on the industrial side, which is why it's a dual purpose.
Yeah. So you have a company which has really had two dual use kind of ideas, and over the last almost decade now, any thoughts on how AI, which you are ahead of your time as a company, and how has it evolved? Are the tool sets changing? Are you able to now do things different than you might have imagined as a company 5 or 10 years ago? In either the commercial or the defense space, but particularly the defense space.
Yeah. So I think if you look at it, and it's happening today too, when we look at startup ecosystem, everyone, and this is kind of my number 7 over the years, I think I did first one about 30 years back. We are told to be narrowly focused and make sure that you get good at one thing, right? Kind of, which is what kind of with every startup, if I think of it, I'm on a venture studio. We advise the same thing: go find your niche, a small thing to go focus on, and that's kind of what startups have done for a long time. Advantage we have had that we have had about 1,000 different AI projects that we have done with either the defense side or the industry side, and it was that how do you go pick what actually works? But the technology has evolved, but it hasn't really. It's not new. And so when it has evolved, we have more processing power, we have more edge computing now, which is just the cloud. It has evolved and it will continue to evolve. But the thing which has been unique is that our failures always teach us more than our success. And as you know, the history of the company, we have our shares of failures in there. And I think that's kind of where I look at it, that it's not really kind of what is the technology changing, it is what not to do. And learning from that and then applying it at this point is probably the bigger secret sauce on what had changed, that we have had plenty of scars.
No.
And then those are more helpful.
No. So maybe going back to Ethan and as well, General Allen talked about the importance of Silicon Valley and technology being brought to bear. You know, there's an old law in physics called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I'm sure some people in this room actually know what that is. When it says you cannot observe the state of a particle without changing the state. So I'm thinking of Ash Carter many years ago taking a delegation of people from deep inside the Pentagon all the way out to Silicon Valley and showing them what was going on and said, hey, we need to be more like them. And then why don't you guys in Silicon Valley help us? And the thought to me at that time was, how can you actually work for the Department of Defense if you're an entrepreneurial Silicon Valley company without being changed to the point where you're no longer an entrepreneurial Silicon Valley company? So Ethan, why don't you give us some thoughts on that, because you're now living with that reality today.
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously certain hard things, right? So like compliance that you have to get through, timelines on the fundraising side that you have to be comfortable with. It comes down to risk tolerance as a company, right? So we have a portfolio-based approach where Every year, we spin up between 3 and 5 products that we invest deeply in actually bringing to the department, with the assumption that probably around half of those products will never actually work out. But because our investors, because the people working on those products, because I'm comfortable with the risk, and because we have a business model that allows us to sort of make those big swings, we can take that risk. We can develop products, like a few of them that we're working on right now, that the DoD likely wouldn't have developed themselves. Half of them will probably long-term be bad bets, but as long as those half that work sort of work well enough to pay off the rest, you can actually operate as a more sort of risky startup. And then it comes down to how are you buying down that risk, right? So part of that is capital structure. How are you just making sure that you're generating returns for your investors on adequate timelines? Part of that is on the CapEx side, right? So if I go and build a factory around a product and that product doesn't work out, that's a very bad position to be in as a company. So we've invested pretty deeply in actually having flexible manufacture, such that we announced it today, actually, our big factory we've brought online, we can make any number of different products in there. That also helps with sort of the idea of hyperwar, because you can iterate very, very quickly, even while producing at rate. And then the final one is engineering and design software. So for our last product we brought to flight is 150-pound, essentially miniature fighter jet, takes off vertically, transitions into horizontal flight. We've done a couple iterations there, but our last clean sheet iteration, we started in September and actually flew the first one in mid-January. This is about a 14-week total sprint to get that done. And so investing very, very deeply in actual software and company structures to allow you to iterate quickly helps you buy down risk. If Viper doesn't work out, you haven't just dumped $1 billion into developing it, right? It's 14 weeks of a third of your engineer's time.
And is your business model using more of your own risk capital to move quickly to what you think the DoD needs? Or do you wait for RFPs to come in and figure out how do you comply with all the requirements and bid against 4 other contractors?
More of the former.
That's a test question.
Definitely the former.
More the former, yeah.
And that obviously takes time, right? Because it takes a while to get requirements written. It takes a while to get dollars moved around. And so that's where having sort of investor commitment, and that's also where having a portfolio-based approach where you can sort of stack timelines of these things against each other, such that by the time one's hitting, you're already working on the next one that will hit in 3 years. It makes it a difficult business to operate because you have to have so many different products. And I think
You got to be. And how many people do you have in the company now?
it's still relatively small. We're like 110, up from like 20 last year. So it's
So you have enough to do something and not so many that you can't move quickly.
yes.
Yes.
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I said, any thoughts you have on this Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Because you're working in both worlds. You're working with big industrial companies with large capital bases, and you're working with the DoD or various DoD elements.
It's kind of been, so I've also worked for for a few years for Hewlett Packard, and my first job was with Northrop, kind of long time back, but that was, but if you look at it, on one side, the commercial businesses are able to move much faster than DoD, right? So when it comes to scale and speed side of it, right? So that at least on the speed metric, it is that kind of commercial side is able to meet faster. And we do a dual purpose platform, right? So everything we do, we have to have kind of applications on both sides. But the thing which is unique, especially kind of when it comes to the hyperwar and warfare and unmanned side, the DoD is willing to take more risk because you're in contested zones. Than the commercial sites are. So it's almost a balanced round. So it's back to that because of some of the things which is why I give you the example of autonomous flying. And so kind of, I think we went down to 2 people in the cockpit for about 30 years back or so. We have not gone down to 1. One is because you don't trust only one person to be in the cockpit too. And trying to go down to the 0 kind of is going to take a long time. On the other side, kind of as Ukraine example that you gave on unmanned, there are things that you can try on the AI side, kind of on the defense side, which you can't really do on the commercial side, but eventually it's coming. It is going to come. So I look at it more of a balance, that kind of what type of innovation do we really do on the DoD side, and what type of speed and scale do we do on the commercial side to balance those two things out. But it's kind of counterintuitive, but it almost says that if you want to do more riskier things, DoD is more open to it. If you want to do fast and scale, the commercial side is more open to it.
So you have an interesting situation in the defense world where we've gone in cycles, where there's been risk on and risk off. And when things were pretty stable, my experience was very little appetite for risk, lots of bureaucracy, everything was blah, 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 blah. Then you'd have a number of catalytic events, like, for example, we had IEDs. And IEDs were like a serious problem, they're killing our guys.
Yeah.
And you had to do something, and the standard procurement system, which 4 or 5 or 10 years from now might come up with a solution, was not going to get it done. We had 9/11, and I remember for almost 9 months, the Pentagon seemed to suspend the rule that anybody in the Pentagon could say no on anything, and suddenly it was, what does it take to get to yes? We went through some other periods, and I think today we're seeing a little more of a recognition that we do have some risk issues, we need some rapid adaptation, which allows. So John, your thoughts as you look at that cycle as a warfighter.
Sure.
And someone who says, hey, I need stuff to deal with the problems now, how do I get around this procurement problem?
Yeah, the bureaucracy is killing us. It's just too slow. And in the context of hyperwar is successful if the entire ecosystem accelerates. Not just the warfighter at the front, not just the logistics coming to the front in a contested environment. It's the entire ecosystem has to accelerate. And the bureaucracy, the interminable legal review, cost overrides, bad estimates on the capacity to deliver technology, et cetera. First, the separation between the public and the private sector, that separation is a strategic vulnerability. The amount of time it takes to go from concept to fielding can be measured in decades. Still, the Russians and the Chinese are somewhere between 10 and 5 years in order to do this. Now, there's no real separation in that environment.
No.
You know, the Chinese talk about private sector, but it's not really a private sector in that context the way we have. So we're too slow. We are risk averse, but Ron, I agree with you. I think in this administration, in a favorable regulatory environment, we may well find that this could really accelerate. Now, you mentioned a critical name a few minutes ago, and he's left us now, and we miss him every day, and that's Ash Carter.
Yeah.
I had personal experience with him when you talked about the IEDs. He gathered together everyone who either bent metal or wrote code and told them we're going to produce a vehicle that will save our troops' lives. And in record speed, he produced the MATV. I was a war planner at one point, and I needed special weapons for a particular dimension of the war plan. He called in the 4 service deputies, told them to bring their checkbooks, and then they wrote the checks right on the spot for us to accelerate the capacity of these weapons to be procured. It can be done, Ron, but there's a certain amount of risk on legal review and ethics. I think we should take the chance, not because we want to veer towards being illegal or unethical, but I think you put people of honor and values in those jobs, we can move much, much faster. The whole system has to accelerate if we're going to truly be hyperwar capable.
Yeah, and I heard General Milley talk at the Bohemian Grove about this hyperwar world, and it's a little scary when you see how fast it's going. And if you think that the old systems which don't involve AI are going to be okay, that's probably not the future. So you're going to have to take risk in even using AI.
I was in a conversation recently with someone in Ukraine talking about how at the front they're using RPVs, UAVs, they're using UAVs, and they're pulling in huge amounts of data through a system called EYES. So everything that has a data exhaust is coming to a central location. They're using the cloud, the hyperscale cloud, with certain kinds of artificial intelligence for the scaling and the analysis of the data. They're changing right on the spot the targeting data for the UAVs, and they're sending them out immediately in a dynamic targeting process. Now, I don't know that we could do that, frankly. This is a survival issue and an existential moment for them, and they're able to do that kind of thing using existing digital technology. We can't do that in our own system. We've got to be able to accelerate.
Yeah. It's interesting. So let me just ask Ethan, so a lot of companies that are moving very innovatively are working in the software domain, and software, frankly, is a little easier to move quickly on than hardware. Maybe sometimes you don't feel that way, but I don't want to minimize, Avathon. But so you're on the hardware side, which is harder, actually. That's what I call it, hardware. Why did you pick that side? How do you see that? How do you get yourself to move at the speed of software, even though you're doing really important hardware stuff?
It's a great question. So first off, we do write some software.
I'm sure you have a little software in there, so everybody has software.
Our UAVs do deploy AI and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But you're right? Like our spot in the value chain is very hardware centric. And I mean, on my end, I saw that as the more sort of pressing need in the ecosystem. So for us, there's this classic saying, sort of software enabled hardware ecosystem, and that's very, very valuable. And I'm very glad people are working in that space. But we also have to make sure we have vertically integrated survivable manufacturing capacity. If we can't make radios by the millions when we have to go to war, if we can't do the same for avionics and jet engines, we'll be in a very bad place. Right. And so that's where Mach looks to drop in. A, because there's a lot of work being done on software. B, because I think that's arguably the most existential thing right now, because that's the thing we're losing the worst to China on. Right? If you look at Ukraine, even Ukrainian-built UAVs are built with Chinese subcomponents.
Yep.
You go and actually open up the box, and it's a Chinese flight controller, it's a Chinese radio, it's Chinese servos. And so the need for an ecosystem of sort of vertically integrated, survivably manufactured, U.S.-based UAV subcomponents is pretty existential.
Yeah. Let me just pause now and open it up if anyone in the audience has a question or observation. Now, Steve. Do we have a microphone? Are there microphones anywhere or not? If not, go ahead, just project your voice.
So for the last 20 plus years, our military has focused somewhat on stealth and precision.
Wait a minute, we have an incoming here,
Can you hear me?
but it doesn't work.
Can you hear me? There. For the last 20 plus years, our military has focused on stealth and precision strike and low volume and high and very expensive stuff, whether it's an F-35 or a missile or whatever. And it strikes me that maybe that has to change, that quantity has a virtue unto itself. And I heard some statistic that if we went to a shooting war with China, we'd run out of precision strike missiles within a week. So help me understand has that dynamic changed? And if it has changed, what does that imply for the appropriate balance between precision strike, stealth, and quantity of things like drones, or just a lot more unmanned vehicles like unmanned B-21s and unmanned advanced fighters, et cetera?
Well, I think we're certainly moving towards autonomous systems. You know, the loyal wingman process, I think, is going to be very, very valuable as time goes on. But also, Ethan's point, we can't have too many drones going forward. I flew from Taiwan to here, where we had the conversation about what kind of a threat environment they need to create in order to create the deterrent that make a cross-strait operation simply tactically or strategically untenable. And it's all about autonomous drone systems, whether they're surface, subsurface, or aerial systems. So I think I don't know what the balance is right now, but what we have isn't nearly sufficient for what we will need given the threat scenarios that we're going to face. So I think more emphasis on autonomy and more emphasis on quantity, I think, is exactly the way to go. And by the way, quantity does not necessarily, and I'm not questioning your question or your point, quantity doesn't also mean you sacrifice precision. Some of these systems are extraordinarily precise, and when you've got the sky full of a swarm of very precise capabilities, it complicates enormously the capacity of the enemy to maneuver or even be secure in their defensive positions. Great question.
Any other questions? Yes, next question. You make it easy on me, then I don't have to invent new questions. So.
I'll do my best.
Just
I
talking
think
to
Steve ruined it.
Does that work? Oh, hey. Wars become catastrophic when people don't really understand what the technology has done to warfare. The classic case would be World War I, where mechanization totally wiped out previous ideas about warfighting.
Absolutely.
World War II, blitzkrieg,
Yep.
And motorized warfare. You could make cases with Vietnam and low-level counteracting. You each represent something different. You have optimizations of highly engineered systems. You have technology deployed at massive scale. And in the Marines, the fighting man do we understand what these kind of wars look like from each of your perspectives? And even more urgently, do we understand what the opposition might look like? And does the opposition understand us?
I'll come in. I want to come in. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I can start. I don't personally think so. I think things are changing so quickly. And so not to point to us, but like we're currently flying a capability that I, as a single operator, could put up and strike a target anywhere on Earth for like $20,000. And we'll be able to make those as a company in the scale of hundreds of thousands, and as a country in the scale of millions. And if you're China, maybe in the scale of hundreds of millions. And so I think the reality of like, what does it look like to get an aircraft off the ground when capabilities like that exist? What does it look like to actually manufacture from a factory anywhere on Earth, even here in the US, when capabilities like that exist? So I totally agree. I think we're at this pretty frightening inflection point of radical change in the way wars will be fought. And I think quadcopters with grenades strapped to them are kind of the first order effect here. And if you look at Ukraine, if you look at like 20 miles on each side of the front, that's what we're seeing. But some of these assets are incredibly long range and still prolific. So China just ordered 1 million long range strike drones, essentially like Shahed equivalents, 1,000+ mile range. And then to tie back into your question about what does it look like to fight with scale, I think the logical conclusion of that line of thinking is let's go and build these things at insane scale. Let's go and blitz scale manufacture. And I actually think that's a bit of a misguided approach, because the unfortunate thing is, if we're making a cruise missile and China's making a cruise missile, they're going to outproduce us on that cruise missile 10 to 100x. And so we actually do need to dig into what makes us sort of unique as a country. And it's tech like the B-21. It's in many ways, unfortunately, I think less so recently, but software dominance. And so we really do need to fight asymmetrically. And then we need to take a really serious look about what does it look like to have a survivable manufacturing base? What does it look like to have like secure energy logistics? What do these platforms look like in the next major war?
You ask a really important point. And, I don't have to have a class on Clausewitz here, but Clausewitz said war is either dominated by the character of war, which is the technical dimension, or the nature of war, which is the human dimension. And strategic surprise has traditionally occurred, and you gave us two good examples, when the nature of war, the human dimension, doesn't understand the full potential for the technical dimension. That's where we are now. And a couple of years ago, to the great credit of the Department of the Navy, and I assume the other services did it as well, we did a complete review of the educational system of the officers of the Navy to install in the curricula of the various, from the Naval Academy to the War College and the Naval Postgraduate School, an awareness of the inherent evolution of technology today, so that the education prepares the human dimension for war to be able to wield the technical aspect of the character of war. But we're still out of sync. Technology is not just changing, it is changing so fast that keeping the human's capacity to understand the full potential of these technologies and the application on the battlefield is one of the great challenges that we face. Because we can't ultimately turn the battlefield over to autonomous systems. There still needs to be a commander in the loop in some form or another. And if that commander fully understands the capabilities of those systems, then we have some hope of applying them to the maximum extent possible to win in the fight. And that's what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine. Very young commanders, very young senior leaders, if you will, brigade commanders who are very young, are making very hard decisions that we almost can't imagine having to be made in our own military today. And many of the UAVs that are flying around the battlefield now are streaming fiber optic cables, which gives UAVs incredible accuracy at relatively long range. That's why, they constantly keep their eye on the sky, because from the sky will be your death. There is no Marine today, with the exception of some of our special operators who are doing things overseas. There's no Marine today that ever had to worry about being attacked from the air in our living memory. Right. Today, on the modern battlefield, if we encounter the Chinese or the Russians, we can't take our eyes off the sky, because death will come from UAVs and other of those sophisticated systems. We have to understand them. We've got to be educating our leaders.
Yeah, the control of the skies was always something we assumed since the beginning of the Cold War. Hey, maybe just to wrap here, let's talk a little bit about the human dynamic. Not too many years ago, about 8,000 or 9,000 engineers at Google signed a petition that said Google should not be doing any contract work for the Department of Defense, because finding and catching terrorists using AI might get people hurt. or something of that sort. And the company basically reneged on its contract. Later, it's quietly come back again. You guys are operating with really bright, smart, young people. Obviously, you're not always in the same milieu as a Google is. How do you guys think about motivating your people? How do you make sure that everybody understands how you square the circle, that what you're doing is really important so that they can have the lives they want to have? Pervinder, why don't you,
Yeah.
because you're living in the book.
Yeah, nobody works for me, so
Yeah.
they have to deal with it.
I think part of it has always been that there's a balance between something like national defense and developing technology for defense purposes than for offensive purposes. So if you think of, I'm trying to remember if I was still at HP when Google did that, and we were doing fair amount of work with DoD kind of at that time too. But it always was that kind of, that you can't really ignore that aspect, because at the end of the day, the other part that I think we didn't talk enough about, our ability to manufacture, which is I think what you're getting to. And it's not only about kind of the speed, but also scale of that manufacturing. But most of the people we have, one, it's a mix of people who have served in armed forces, as well as young kind of students coming out of UT Austin and UC Berkeley and others. And there's a balance that we have had, that kind of that we do dual purpose technology. So person coming in knows that upfront. But part of the issue that happened with Google is that it started off kind of from a completely different place.
Right.
If you think of when early days of Google back kind of 25, 30 years back, to where it evolved into, is why there was that conflict internally that came in. But when you look at Avathon, when you're starting off, kind of, we are also at kind of 200 some employees or so. People are coming in knowing that this is kind of
So
part
they're
of the mission.
self-selecting in some ways.
Yeah.
And Ethan, just quickly, your gang?
Yeah, I think a near peer conflict inspires a different level of motivation, right? Like it's pretty clear that it's existential for us as a country to get these next 2 decades of technology right. And so I think it's pretty motivating to work on solving those problems.
Because I know in my day growing up, Sputnik was launched when I was a little boy, and that kind of changed everything. And it's sort of like, holy cow, those guys launched a rocket that went around the world. If it went only halfway around the world and came down on us with a nuclear weapon, that could be a bad day. And that kind of launched the sense that it was okay for smart technical kids, math majors, physics majors, to do this. We went through a period of lull, maybe because we were successful in the Cold War, and now I think we're back at it again. So, General Allen, any final comments you have for us?
Well, it's a great question that you asked, and I think when I talk to folks about this, I try to explain to them that the advances in these technologies, war is coming, war is upon us, wars will continue to come. These technologies give us greater capacity to preserve life than necessarily to take life. You know, sadly, war is about homicide, but war doesn't have to be about murder. It's a subtle difference. Most people never think of it in those terms. I believe that the kinds of technologies that we can embrace in our military gives us the capacity to apply force in a legal way so that in the end we actually preserve life, not arbitrarily take life through the murderous effect of weapons that are out of control. And I think that's a really important explanation for young engineers who are confused, as they should be, about the taking of human life.
Right, and it's the mission. Well, panelists, thank you so much for being here today. This was really intellectually nourishing. And thank you very much, audience, for your questions and engagement.
Thank you.